But first tonight, accusations of sabotage from within the Liberal ranks during the federal election. The New South Wales Treasurer and climate change champion Matt Kean has been caught intervening in the election campaign Scott Morrison was bitterly fighting. Just 11 days before polling day, Kean messaged a young journalist on the road with Morrison, encouraging her to pursue the political controversy over the Warringah candidate Katherine Deves. These are the text messages. Channel 10 Stella Todorovic shared with Kean a tweet that she had tweeted, where Deves had backtracked on her apology for saying transgender kids had been surgically mutilated. Stella then wrote, "We definitely pushed it along. I tried to get Natalie on it and she seemed keen to chat, but Morrison ended the presser and she was forced to leave." Stella was referring there to Natalie Ward. She's the New South Wales Minister for Roads, also the Minister for Women. And she was standing by Scott Morrison's side at an election campaign press conference to announce funding for a bridge in Sydney. Matt Kean replied to this message, "You should pap her." Those messages on Twitter's direct messaging platform. The conversation continued on. Now, this was just 11 days before polling day, a critical time in the election campaign. And Scott Morrison was trying to put the Deves issue behind him to focus attacks on Labor and Anthony Albanese. And yet here you had a senior figure in the New South Wales Liberal government encouraging a journalist to pursue the Deves political controversy that was hurting Morrison. News of this message exchange reached the PM at the time. His principal private secretary, Euron Finkelstein, phoned Matt Kean, and it's understood he told him that he was aware of his messages with journalists. A second person close to Morrison also raised the issue with Kean, but the New South Wales Treasurer denied it all and said he was doing everything in his power to help Morrison win. It's a claim he made again on Sky News Today with Andrew Clennell.
There was a story in The Australian by Sharri Markson that talked about you texting a Channel 10 reporter trying to get a question to Natalie Ward about Katherine Deves. I assume this is true. Can you take us through what all this is about?
Well, I wouldn't normally comment on private conversations, but because it's in the public domain, all I'll say is that a reporter that worked in the New South Wales Gallery contacted me about a political matter. I responded with some light-hearted banter, but the suggestion that I was asking the reporter to ask questions of anyone in particular is just false.
But doesn't that look like, or it seems from the Morrison camp, there's a belief that you might have been trying to undermine Scott Morrison by suggesting that a question go to Natalie Ward, your ministerial colleague, about the Katherine Deves matter?
Not at all.
She wasn't that happy with the Katherine Deves
Not at all. I worked hard to ensure the Morrison government was elected. I fundraised, I campaigned in various seats. In fact, the party asked me to write letters to constituents in a whole range of seats, which I happily did. I wanted to see the Morrison government re-elected, and I worked very hard to make that happen.
You didn't like him, though, or you didn't see eye to eye with him often, and he was always having a shot at, or often having a shot at you, wasn't he? I mean, that's fair.
No, that's not fair. I mean, I had some differences of opinion with some of my federal colleagues, as I do sometimes with my state colleagues.
So Matt Kean called those messages light-hearted banter. I don't know how a suggestion to pap someone is light-hearted banter. But Kean has defended himself to other journalists by saying he was encouraging the reporter to pap Natalie Ward and not Katherine Deves. The claim he'd be encouraging anyone to pap Natalie Ward, the New South Wales Minister for Roads and Women, is absurd. Firstly, she had just been standing there at a press conference with Morrison with dozens of cameras, no need for a pap. But secondly, as you'll recall, it was Katherine Deves who had gone to ground on the orders of the national campaign. She was effectively in hiding. So unless Kean wanted Stella to pap Natalie Ward about Katherine Deves, and if that was the case, again, that is encouraging the reporter to pursue the Deves issue at the height of an election campaign, directly working against Scott Morrison. And the point is not whether Kean was right about Katherine Deves. Everyone has an opinion about whether she should have been the candidate. The point was the sabotage, that he was working against the PM a week and a half out from the election. Labor Premiers Mark McGowan, Anastasia Palaszczuk, Daniel Andrews, they were all doing everything they could to help Anthony Albanese win. But a top politician from one of only 2 state Liberal governments was undermining the then PM. Now, the overwhelming reaction to all of this since we published the story in yesterday's Weekend Australian, you all said that Premier Dominic Perrottet should sack Matt Kean. But you've got to remember, it was only with Kean's support and the backing of the moderates that Perrottet had the numbers to become the Premier in the first place. He owes his very job to Matt Kean, so he'll never do anything to pull him into line. But Perrottet also has another reason to avoid conflict with Kean. There's a push among moderate power brokers for Matt Kean to overthrow Perrottet before New South Wales heads to the polls next year. Some of the moderates think Perrottet is a disappointment, that he isn't cutting through to voters, and the polling shows the New South Wales government is facing a loss potentially greater than the Feds. Now, Matt Kean has been described as so far left that he may as well sit in the Labor Party. And you might remember that 2 years on this show, he ramped up pressure on Scott Morrison over climate change. And he said that Morrison's own cabinet wanted action.
A group of federal MPs, including moderates, are demanding the Morrison government take more action on climate change. You, of course, are the leader of the moderates in New South Wales. What do you know about this?
Look, I don't think it's just moderates that want more action when it comes to reducing our emissions. I think it's people right across the party. I mean, it's not just moderates that have been breathing in the smoke. It's not just moderates that have seen the ash falling out of the sky. It's not just moderates that have been seeing the devastating impacts that these bushfires have had on people, property and our beautiful natural environment. So there is widespread support for the Prime Minister to take strong action when it comes to climate change.
Just in terms of the federal MPs and who are demanding more action be taken on climate change, how senior are some of those MPs? How senior does it go?
My understanding is some of the most senior members of the government, and they're not moderates. They're from the right of the party.
In Cabinet?
And they are saying that this is a huge issue.
In Cabinet?
In Cabinet, absolutely. And can I just say, Sharri, I mean, this is because their communities are crying out. They're listening to the majority of people in their electorates.
Matt Kean has been the most forward-leaning politician in the country pushing the transition to renewable energy. And the New South Wales government chose not to extend the life of the state's largest coal-fired power station that provides 1/5 of the state's energy. Look at this admission from Matt Kean in February this year.
Now, you've known this was a possibility for some 6 to 8 months, and Origin has made it clear publicly that they were prepared to extend the timeline of Eraring. They entered into negotiations with you. My understanding is they were looking for some kind of financial support, similar to what the Victorian government gave Energy Australia with Yallourn. Were you in negotiations about providing that financial support, and did they collapse?
Look, obviously we considered a number of options, but we needed to focus on what were the best options for taxpayers in this state, so how much money we'd shell out, and also what was in the best interests of electricity users, so what was going to keep the lights on, and also put downward pressure on prices.
They were asking was too high.
No, I'm not going to go into commercially sensitive discussions. Market participants come to us because they can negotiate with us in good faith, and they know those commercial decisions are not going to leak out.
But this is clearly in the public interest if the state's largest coal-fired power station that provides 1/5 of our energy wanted to extend its life cycle and sought financial support from the New South Wales government, but it wasn't provided. Why was that?
Because we considered a number of options. Obviously, I'm not going to go into that, that had to weigh up the impact that they would have on taxpayers, the impact they would have on electricity users. Now, we considered those options. They were all on the table, and the decision was taken on the option that was in the best interests of the people of New South Wales.
How can this be in the best interests of the people of New South Wales if you yourself are concerned about power prices and energy security and reliability, which is why you said you were disappointed with the early closure?
We know the best way to put downward pressure on electricity prices is to build additional supply.
But this is taking 1/5 of our supply out of the market.
Well, that's why we need to build additional supply, and we've got a mechanism to do exactly that.
You don't have a plan to fill that gap in just 3 years, which is when Eraring shuts down.
It's extraordinary how our politicians have handled this energy supply issue. And in that interview, Kean denied there was any problem with energy security. Just a few months on, we are now facing an energy crisis, and this is nationwide. The accusation is that politicians like Matt Kean have put ideology and commitment to a fast transition to renewable energy before security, energy supply, reliability, and power prices.